Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm going to get started because there's a fair bit of content to get through today. So, welcome to part 2 of the ASRS webinar series. Today we're going to be focusing on climate scenario analysis, which is probably the most technically involved part of your ASRS obligations, but it's also one of the most useful things that you'll do as part of the process as well. So before we get into it, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. So for me, that is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. Some quick housekeeping before we jump in. So your mics should be muted, your camera should be off. There is a Q&A function to drop in questions as we go, and I'll aim for some time at the end to get through as many as we can, and then I'll also follow up afterwards with any that we're not able to get to. The session is also being recorded, and we'll share that out after the webinar. So if you need to drop off or you want to share it with colleagues or just revisit the content, you'll have that available as well. So in terms of what we'll cover over the next 30 minutes, so I'm going to open with a rundown of what ASRS requires for climate scenario analysis, and then we'll spend the bulk of our time on the practical side. So what climate scenario analysis is, what it looks like in action, and the valuable insights that you can get out of it as well. And then we'll close with some key takeaways from the Group 1 companies that are relevant to where you are now as generally Group 2 reporters here. And we'll aim to finish a couple of minutes early, like I said, to leave room for the Q&A. It's a little bit of an introduction to me. So my name is Ashley Turner. I'm an associate consultant in our climate change and net zero strategy team here at SLR. So my work spans kind of the full scope of ASRS, from the greenhouse gas accounting and the decarbonisation target setting and planning side of things, through to the climate risk and the adaptation planning and transition planning and strategy. So I really do specialize in the climate scenario analysis piece as well. That's where I spend a lot of my time. And over the last couple of years, I've been working really closely with Group 1 companies on their ASRS disclosures, and have been through that ASRS assurance process, and we've had really strong feedback a number of times. So hoping that I can share some really practical insights with you today to go through what this actually looks like. So for those of you who haven't come across SLR before, we're a global environmental and sustainability consultancy. We've got over 5,000 people across nearly 30 different countries, with a numerous amount of technical disciplines, from environment, engineering, scientific, advisory, and then data and digital analytics as well. So for our advisory clients, what this means is that we've got that technical depth behind all our strategic work. So the climate scientists, the engineers and specialists. So make sure that our insights are really grounded in evidence and they can be taken through strategy, through to design and implementation. And in APAC specifically, we're over 1,000 people now. So the majority are in Australia, but we have a strong New Zealand team and growing presence in Southeast Asia and China as well. So we've got that local regulatory context, but also that upstream value chain knowledge as well. So today is webinar 2 in our ASRS series, and part 1, which is where to get started, that was run by my colleague James last month, and it covered kind of those fundamentals of ASRS and what it requires. So if you missed that one, the recording is available. It's a useful complement to today, but it's not a prerequisite for what we're going to go through. And then across Q2 and Q3, we've got a full series lined up. So relevant is the covering ASRS transition planning webinar, and then there's a number of other related ones. So stay tuned for those as well. But today's focus is entirely on that climate scenario analysis piece. So I want to start with the regulatory context. So the goal to kind of make sure everyone's clear on exactly what ASRS requires before we get into that practical methodology. So if you weren't part of part one, this is ASRS essentially in its simplest form. So there's really three things that ASRS wants you to do. So first, understanding the impact that your business has on climate. So that's your emissions picture. So your scope 1 and 2 emissions from your operations, your scope 3 value chain emissions, and then any other relevant metrics and targets as well. The second part, which is what we're talking about today, is to understand the impact climate change would have on your business. So this is where climate scenario analysis sits, and it involves identifying your climate-related risks and opportunities, running your scenario analysis across different futures, and then assessing your resilience as well. And the third kind of piece of ASRS is the so what. So that's your transition plan. So how are you managing your impact on climate through decarbonisation? How are you managing climate's impact on you through mitigation and adaptation? And then today's focus, like I said, is also on that. It's on that second bucket. So the impact from climate, specifically scenario analysis, which sits at the center of that impact from climate piece. So what does ASRS actually require for scenario analysis? So looking at the disclosure table on the left, the key thing to understand is that the identification and prioritization of your climate risks and opportunities is required in year one with limited assurance. The climate scenario analysis, which supports and informs that risk and opportunity identification, it needs to be disclosed in year one as well, but that assurance over the scenario analysis itself doesn't kick in until year two. So CSA is a key step in understanding and prioritizing your risks and opportunities, and so doing that right in the first year is really important. And on the right, we have the scenario design requirements. So you need at least, under ASRS, you need to look at least 2 externally referenced climate scenarios. So 1 low warming, which is below 2 degrees, and 1 high warming, which is considered to be above 2.5 degrees. You need to assess these across 3 time horizons. So you need to look at your short-term, medium-term, and long-term time horizons. But I'll note that the definitions aren't specific under the standard. They're not set by the standard, but you need to make them specific to your business context. So these timeframes for climate, they tend to be longer than typical risk frameworks because climate risks often materialize over much longer timeframes. So your long term might look to align with asset life cycles, for example, going out to 2100, or your decarbonisation targets and planning time horizons, so maybe going out to 2050, say. So in terms of the scope of what you need to cover both physical risks, so think extreme storms, heat, flooding, and transition risks, as well as opportunities. So policy changes, things like the implementation of carbon pricing or shifts in market. And you need to look at these across your full value chain, so not just your direct operations. And the last thing I'll note on the design of the climate scenario analysis is regarding the level of quantification of your risks and opportunities. So under the standard, you need to undertake both a qualitative and a quantitative analysis, and it's worth being clear on what that means here. So the qualitative analysis assesses the financial implications of your risks and opportunities, but more in directional terms. So is this likely to have a significant positive or negative effect on your business? Whereas the quantitative analysis, it goes further and it puts an actual financial figure or range on those impacts. So the amount of revenue that's at risk, or the capex exposure, in insurance cost increases, for example. So from year one, ASRS does require both where possible, but where it isn't possible because of things like undue cost or effort or kind of genuine capability constraints, then the expectation is that you clearly demonstrate why it's not possible in the first instance and demonstrate how you're going to build towards that over time. So there's guidance on this, but ultimately it is required. So getting into some of the substance of climate scenario analysis specifically, so this is the kind of most interesting part and the bulk of the session. And I think once you see how it kind of works in practice, it will become more approachable and also clear how valuable the outputs are as well. So I want to start with the bigger picture. So to highlight why climate scenario analysis kind of exists as a tool. So when it comes to climate, there's a lot of uncertainty about what the future looks like. The graph on the left is showing the major shared socioeconomic pathways, or the SSPs. And these are essentially climate scenarios that are developed by the leading global climate science body, the IPCC. And so these show how global temperatures are projected to change on different emissions futures. From the lowest warming pathway, so that bottom line there, which is a world that rapidly decarbonizes and limits warming, and then all the way up to that SSP 5 to 8.5 on the top, which is that high emissions scenario where temperatures could climb by, say, 4 degrees or more by the end of the century. And what we can say with high confidence is that if global emissions don't reduce significantly, then we'll see adverse physical climate impacts continuing to intensify. So things like drought, fire weather, compounding floods, extreme heat, sea level rise. So all these things that we typically think when we think about climate risk, they're already increasing, and under a high warming pathway, they'd get substantially worse. And then on the other side, we have the transition risk. So if the world doesn't move to reduce emissions, if it does move to reduce emissions, the mechanisms that drive that transition create a different set of risks and opportunities. So policy changes, again, implementation of carbon pricing, technology shifts, things like litigation, these are the transition risk drivers. So the pace here matters. So if we see kind of a rapid, orderly transition, it's going to create more manageable, more predictable change, and it will reduce physical hazards. But if we see a bit more of a delayed transition and then a sudden shift, it can create more abrupt transition pressures. So that tension between the physical risks and the transition risks is exactly what scenario analysis is designed to help you navigate. So it's a tool that's kind of forcing you to look at a range of plausible futures, understand what each of them means for your business so that you can build strategy and plans that are resilient across those different futures. And so you're not just preparing for one outcome here when we could see a lot of variability. I want to just break down quickly the types of risks more specifically as well, because this taxonomy is used throughout the ASRS. So in terms of physical risks, those direct impacts from climate change, we split them into acute, which are the event-driven risks, so things like floods or cyclones, for example. And then we also have chronic risks, which are the slower moving shifts in climate patterns, so things like rising temperatures, changing precipitation, sea level rise, for example. So the chronic risks can be just as material as acute risks over time. They can gradually degrade site viability, they can strain infrastructure, affect workforce productivity, and they often tend to be underweighed because they don't show up as dramatically in a single event, but they're very important to consider. And then transition risks, they arise from the global shift towards a low carbon economy. So there's 4 main categories here. We've got the policy and legal risks, for example, new regulations, carbon pricing, litigation, market risks, which are those shifts in supply and demand, and then technology risks, so things like new low carbon technologies that might emerge and affect your competitiveness. And then the last one is reputational risks, those changing expectations from customers, investors, communities, and other stakeholders about what climate action looks like and the action that you're undertaking. So it's really common in workshops for people to have a good intuitive grasp of acute physical risks and much hazier on the chronic risks sometimes, and particularly transition risks. So one thing we do in this process is specifically make sure that we're drawing out those less obvious risks, and they often turn out to be among some of the most material. Alongside the risks, you've also got to identify and assess opportunities, so the upside from the transition. And these are bucketed into resource efficiency, so how might you be able to reduce your operational costs through better energy and materials management, energy sourcing, so maybe cost savings from renewable energy transition, products and services, so what new products and services might you be able to kind of delve into, like low emissions technologies, market access, and then resilience as well, so building that adaptive capacity to protect your long-term resilience can also be a really strong opportunity. So now we kind of got all that background. I want to take you through how we actually approach it and show what it looks like in practice, including a bit of an example as well of a risk assessment output. So our approach to climate scenario analysis follows 5 stages, and I've grouped them into 3 here. So phase 1 is really setting those foundations, and it involves 2 steps. The first is selecting and defining your climate scenarios. So agree on what your low warming scenario looks like, what your high warming one is, what are your time horizons, what are the geographies that you're covering, your assumptions, and external data sources. And this is the first step here because in order to understand what risks might arise, you need to know what futures you're looking at. And then the second step there is identifying your potential risks and opportunities. So using things like industry reports, climate data as well to inform this initial list, but really importantly, engaging across the business functions is key here, and because you want to capture the full value chain perspective, and your business knows your business best. So really important to engage across business. And this results in a list of risks and opportunities mapped out across your operations and your value chain. For the phase 2, once we have that initial list, we move on to evaluating how bad these risks actually are. So we score each of the risks and opportunities through a detailed analysis. Again, super important here to engage across those business functions. So, for example, risk, finance, operations, health and safety, not just sustainability, so that you can make sure that the analysis is really capturing that business perspective really effectively. And as part of the climate scenario analysis, your resilience is also assessed. So it's really important to uncover your ability to adapt to each of the risks across the different futures and identify those gaps in your current strategy and the mitigation and adaptation measures that exist, but then also future planning. So this is kind of the bulkiest section, this analysis section. It's where a lot of the work happens. And we typically feed all of this into a series of workshops to really test the climate risk and opportunity scoring. And then the phase 3 is where the CSA, of course, it feeds into your disclosure, but really importantly, it's the basis of the resilience element of your transition plan. So we understand your risk exposure, we understand your current resilience, but now we have a future view across scenarios and time horizons for where those gaps are and what actions need to be taken to ensure resilience in the plausible futures. So ultimately, it's the climate scenario analysis is feeding into your strategic responses and your detailed adaptation planning. So I just want to say a little bit more about the scenario selection, because this is kind of a common one that comes up. So it's basically, you need 2 scenarios under the ASRS, the low warming one below 2 degrees and a high warming scenario above 2.5 degrees. One thing that I want to flag from Group 1 experience is that there is some variability in how companies are interpreting the scenario requirements. So particularly around which SSP to use as the low warming scenario. So both the SSP 1 to 1.9 and the 1 to 2.6 have been used, and we've seen different assurers accept different approaches. So our view is that the SSP 1 to 2.6 is robust and defensible low warming choice, given that the requirement is less than 2 degrees. And the SSP 1 to 1.9 scenario, that is also robust and defensible and is the most ambitious pathway. But we have seen, some variability across which one is selected. For the high warming scenarios, they don't specify the high warming requirement in the standard, but the best practice would be to consider one of the top two to best understand and prepare for that worst case physical hazards. And in practice, we typically recommend a third middle of the road scenario because this is often surfacing a distinct set of risks that you might miss within those two extremes. And then on the time horizons, your definitions just need to make sense for your business and your assets. So for a company with long-lived infrastructure, that long term might extend out to 2100 like it does here in this example. For others, if you have kind of shorter planning horizons, maybe it looks more like your long term being around 2050 to align with your net zero target, for example. But it's just really important to be clear about your definitions and make sure that you're applying them consistently throughout. And so this slide is just aiming to illustrate the scope again of the risks and opportunities. So it's really easy to focus only on your direct operations, but climate risk plays out across the entire value chain, and ASRS is explicit that you need to consider that full picture. So upstream suppliers, your own operations, and then downstream customers and markets. So looking at the physical risk examples on the grid, so upstream, you might see things like supply chain disruption from extreme weather or increased cost of supplies, for example. In your operations, it might be things like asset damage from cyclones and floods or workforce health and safety impacts. In the downstream, it could be things like delivery delays or customer vulnerability to climate hazards as well. So those disruptions could then lead back to disruptions for you. So important to consider. And then on the transition side, upstream can bring things like increased raw material costs. Operations, you might see carbon pricing and emissions costs, and downstream, you might be looking at declining demand for carbon intensive products or increased customer concern on climate action. So really important to consider across this full value chain and map this out when you get that initial risk and opportunity list. Once we've identified that initial long list of potential risks and opportunities, you put them through a rigorous scoring process. So our methodology is built on the ISO standard for climate risk assessments, and the approach has been through ASRS assurance a number of times. So we have that confidence that the outputs here will hold up. So for risks, the scoring has two familiar elements, magnitude and likelihood. That works similarly to most standard risk frameworks that you likely already have. And then the climate-specific element that tends to be new for people is vulnerability. So that's made up of three components. Your exposure, so is the business activity located where the hazard will occur? Sensitivity, so how affected will your operations be? So for example, do you have key concentration points like a single processing facility or a major logistics hub? And then adaptive capacity. So what is your inherent ability to adjust and respond? So this is where existing mitigations and operational flexibility will come in. And together these feed into an overall risk score. And then for opportunities, we score on the size of the opportunity and the ability to execute as well. And everything is scored across climate scenarios and time horizons. So you can see how that profile evolves over time. So I want to bring this to life with an example. So this is the kind of walkthrough that we'd go through in a workshop, climate risk and opportunity workshop. So in this example, the risk is increasing frequency and severity of weather impacts on logistics and transport. So specifically thinking about how extreme rainfall, high winds, cyclones could disrupt inbound logistics through things like port closures, disruption to shipping routes, road flooding, for example, and how that could lead to delivery delays or high logistics costs or stock shortages. So looking at the left-hand side of the slide, we'd walk through kind of the description of the risk and then the potential distinct consequences and ways that it could impact you. So in this example, things like delays in product availability, which could lead to reduced sales or higher costs from rerouting, for example. And then we run through key scoring insights typically as well. So what sits behind the numbers. So in this example, there's a reliance on 2 ports for 100% of inbound goods, which is creating a concentration point that heightens sensitivity. If either of those ports are to go down, the impacts could be really significant. And then on the right, you see the scenario risk assessment score matrices. So we've got unmitigated scores and mitigated scores across the orderly, disorderly, and hothouse scenarios that we introduced earlier, and each of the time horizons. So here you're seeing that the unmitigated scores show that the risk is increasing over time, and it's more pronounced under the disorderly and hothouse. In the long term, under those pathways, we're looking at recurring downtime at key ports, road flooding and access routes disrupted, for example. And then we've got the mitigated score on the right, which is reflecting those existing mitigation measures. So things like buffer stock, having dual ports, having a domestic sourcing strategy under development in this example. So in a workshop, we'd be feeding this back and we'd be saying, are there any consequences that have been missed here? Is there anything that's not as relevant to you? Do you kind of agree with what mitigations have been captured and your ability to adapt? And do you agree with this assessment and how it's evolving over time? And then one thing that makes our assessments really robust is that they're grounded in site-specific climate data as well from our climate science team, CLIM Systems, and they provide point-specific projections for climate hazards. So in this example, we're looking at extreme precipitation across a 48-hour period, and you can see the baseline year and then how that would project over different climate scenarios and time horizons. So then you'd think about in the hothouse, we're seeing an increase of 180% in precipitation at your site. What does that mean in practice? So it might mean reassessing flood barrier specifications or reviewing your drainage infrastructure or considering whether certain locations are viable over the long term. So that translation from climate data to business decision is where that real value sits and is what the CSA is aiming to uncover. So following that example, to close, we're getting close to time, I want to share just what we've learned from Group 1 reporting, particularly around scenario analysis. So there's 6 main learnings. So firstly, setting a clear materiality position. So your materiality position is shaping everything, every decision in your disclosure. So what you assess in depth, how you identify your risks and opportunities, how you justify what's included and what's not in the report. So it needs to be really well documented, it needs to be deliberate, and it needs to be defensible. So one thing to note here is like aligning your climate risk methodology with your broader enterprise risk thresholds can be a really good way to do this, so that that scoring framework is speaking the same language as your existing risk management. And then it's also worth understanding that ASRS materiality has specific considerations. So you're assessing what's material to primary users of your financial statements and what could reasonably be expected to affect your financial position and performance. So getting clarity on this early really sets that tone. The financial quantification, I did cover this one earlier, but the expectation is becoming clearer that financial figures are expected, and the guidance confirms that quantitative disclosure is required, but there's some nuance. So you can recognize that information may not be available without undue cost or effort, or that measurement uncertainty may be too high. So it gives you some room, particularly in year 1, for shifting between qualitative and quantitative disclosure. But you need to have it really well documented. Under the scenario selection, use recognized externally referenced scenarios and avoid unnecessary complexity. So companies that have tried to build their own scenario narratives found that it's time consuming and really data light. So we recommend using the global standard scenarios like the IPCC and the NGFS because they're a good foundation and you can build from there. Engage across the business. We also talked about this, but it's not a sustainability team exercise. Really important to get those insights across the business throughout the whole process to make sure that you're getting really reliable and useful information. And also upskilling is really key to this process as well, because we've noted that knowledge around climate risk is a bit patchy. So that upskilling is really important. And then the last two are around building clear and defensible documentation. So your assumptions, your data sources, your methodology, making sure that's really traceable for that assurance process. And then the last one being engage early on assurance. So we've seen the Assura approaches vary. It's a new standard. There is a lot of variability in how it's being interpreted. And so have those conversations early, get clear on things like which scenarios that you can use, which risks you're going to report, and align on your intentions and expectations so that you don't have a bit of a pressure point when you go for that review and sign off later on. And just to wrap up, I just wanted to bring it back to the timeline. So the full CSA journey, it takes around 6 months or more. The bulk of the work sits in that assessment of risks and opportunities. So really important to get started on this now so that you can do it in the right way and make sure that all the outputs of this are really useful for your business and your strategy over time as well. And it's not just doing it for the regulatory requirement. That is everything I wanted to cover today. We don't have time to open up Q&A, but if you have sent some questions through, I'll be able to see those and respond to them and send me through a note if you do have any additional questions. But thank you all for your time today. And we'll stop sharing and have a lovely rest of the day.